Today, we're going to dig into a scenario that, honestly, it sounds like it's straight out of a political thriller, but it's a hypothetical that reveals some really deep cracks in our global system. What happens if U.S. forces capture the president of Venezuela? We're about to dive into this massive clash of laws, economics, and just raw power.
And boom, it all kicks off with this, an absolutely explosive accusation made at an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. This single statement put the entire world on high alert and just framed the whole conflict in the starkest terms imaginable.
So let's start right there, where the story really blows up, inside the halls of the United Nations. This was a charge that didn't just question a single action, it challenged the very foundations of international diplomacy.
And look, this wasn't some vague complaint. Venezuela laid out a very specific four-point accusation. They're talking about an armed U.S. attack, bombardments of civilian targets, critical infrastructure being destroyed, and then the climax, the kidnapping of their head of state. This wasn't presented as a diplomatic disagreement. Oh no, this was presented as an act of war.
This accusation immediately throws us into this really strange legal paradox. It forces us to look at two completely different and frankly conflicting worlds of law. You've got the whole international community on one side, and then you have the U.S. legal system on the other.
And that leads us to the central question of this entire explainer. How in the world can the exact same event be seen as a flagrant crime by pretty much the rest of the world, but be considered a totally permissible procedure inside the United States?
And this image, it just illustrates that divide perfectly. On one side, you have international law, which says, nope, you absolutely cannot seize a leader on foreign soil. Forbidden. But on the other side, you have U.S. law, which basically argues, hey, how the defendant got to court, that's not really our problem. The trial is what matters.
So, to put it really simply, they're looking at two different moments in time. The international view says a line was crossed back there. A country's sovereignty was violated, and that's the crime. The U.S. domestic view says, well, the person is here now, in a U.S. courtroom, and that's all that matters for the trial to begin. And this strange legal justification, it's called the Ker-Frisbie doctrine.
So what is this thing? Well, the Ker-Frisbie doctrine isn't some new idea. It's been around for over a century. It was famously backed up by the Supreme Court back in 1992 in a case involving a Mexican doctor who was abducted by DEA agents, and the court essentially said, he's here now so the trial can proceed. It's a principle that, as you can imagine, causes a ton of international outrage, because most other countries would say an illegal capture means the case gets thrown out immediately.
But here's the thing. While all the lawyers and diplomats are raging about the legal arguments, a lot of analysts believe that's all just a smokescreen. They think the real driver of this conflict is a high-stakes economic battle that could totally reshape the global order.
Yeah, according to the analysis, the legal stuff, the political justifications, that's just the cover story for a much, much bigger fight. This is really about a brutal competition for economic control, especially in a region the U.S. has always considered its own backyard.
Just look at this number. Over $500 billion. That's the mind-boggling scale of China's trade with Latin America. And this isn't just some small change. It's a massive economic shift that has completely redrawn the geopolitical map. China isn't some minor player here anymore. For many of these nations, it's their #1 trading partner.
And that's where this idea of economic warfare comes into play. The battle isn't just being fought with legal briefs or diplomatic notes. It's a fight for control over resources, over supply chains, and over the financial systems that the entire global economy runs on.
Now, at the very heart of this economic fight is something called the petrodollar system. The analogy used to explain it is perfect. Imagine if every grocery store in the world agreed you could only buy bread with special store tokens. Well, everybody would need those tokens, right? That would give the person who makes the tokens incredible power. That's what the petrodollar does for the U.S. dollar.
So this is the nightmare scenario for the U.S. economy. Venezuela, which is sitting on the largest oil reserves on the entire planet, reportedly decides to just opt out. It starts selling its oil for Chinese yen instead of dollars. If that happens, other countries might follow, global demand for the dollar could plummet, and the cost for the U.S. just to pay the interest on its own debt could absolutely explode. This isn't just a political threat, it's an existential economic one. Okay, so let's zoom out even further. An event like this, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It actually fits into a much bigger and honestly more troubling pattern, a growing crisis of trust in American foreign policy and its promises.
And this gets us to a really crucial insight from the analysis. The problem isn't that adversaries doubt America's military power. They don't. Everyone knows what the U.S. military can do.
No, the real damage to U.S. credibility, the real crisis of trust, comes from a growing belief that America simply won't keep its word.
This timeline, wow, it really paints a picture, doesn't it? In 2003, Libya gives up its weapons programs in exchange for security guarantees. Years later, its leader is overthrown with U.S. support. In 2015, Iran signs a landmark nuclear deal, and a few years later, the U.S. just walks away. From an adversary's point of view, these aren't isolated incidents. They're proof that making a deal with America is a risk. So the critical question is, why would any new Venezuelan leader ever trust a security guarantee from the United States?
And I mean, this quote from a former national security advisor just says it all, right? The world knows America's military is overwhelmingly powerful, and that's exactly why the credibility of its promises, not its threats, has become the single most important and most damaged tool it has.
Okay, so after an event that shatters international rules and lays bare the raw economic stakes, we have to ask, what comes next? What are the potential futures here?
With the old rulebook pretty much thrown in the trash, we're left in this deeply uncertain new reality. The analysis points to three very different paths this whole thing could take, and they range from a stable new beginning to absolute chaos.
So the analysis lays out three distinct possibilities. The best-case scenario for the U.S. is a new, stable government that's friendly to its interests. The absolute nightmare scenario is fragmentation. The country just collapses into warring factions, kind of like we saw in Iraq and Libya. And then there's a third, very real possibility, a long-term proxy war, fought not with guns, but with dollars and yuan, as China and its allies pour money in to bankroll resistance to American influence.
And that leaves us with this final, crucial question. In a world where the old rules seem to be breaking down, we have to ask ourselves what strength really means anymore. Is it just about having the power to punish your enemies? Is it about having the integrity to actually keep your promises? Or, as more and more analysts are suggesting, is the greatest source of a nation's power its ability to solve its own problems and heal its divisions at home? The answer to that is probably going to define the global balance of power for a long, long time.